The fluorescent lights hummed softly above the long concrete corridor of the training range, their pale glow bouncing off polished steel racks and worn wooden benches. It was late afternoon, the time when most of the recruits had already finished their live-fire exercises and the place had begun to quiet down, leaving only the distant echo of gunfire from the far bays where a handful of dedicated shooters were still finishing their drills. At the very end of the range, near the corner where the cleaning station stood, a woman in a simple faded shirt and jeans worked with steady, practiced hands, wiping down the surfaces of a disassembled rifle. Her hair was tied back in a loose braid, strands of gray glinting under the lights, and her movements carried none of the hurried clumsiness of the new recruits who often fumbled with cleaning rods and oilcloths. She wasn't a soldier, not officially, not anymore. To most people in the facility she was just Maria, the quiet woman who came in every day to help maintain the range, to sweep brass casings, to wipe down the benches, and to make sure the rifles were cleaned and ready for the next wave of men who thought themselves warriors. There was nothing about her appearance that suggested anything remarkable. She was short, a little rounded from years of home-cooked meals, her face plain, the kind you'd pass by in a grocery store without a second glance. Yet the way her hands moved, methodical, confident, and precise, hinted at a knowledge few suspected she carried. The range was supposed to be reserved that day for a group of visiting Navy SEALs, men whose reputations preceded them like thunder before a storm. They had arrived earlier in the morning, towering figures in their tactical gear, their voices loud with jokes and banter, every gesture radiating the kind of unshakable confidence only men at the top of their game could wear. They fired in tight groups, controlled bursts that chewed up paper targets with brutal efficiency, and even the regular instructors who had seen thousands of shooters pass through couldn't help but nod at the display of skill. Maria had stayed at the edges of the bay, quietly gathering the used brass casings and sweeping up behind them, unnoticed in the background like a piece of furniture. She was used to it. Being invisible was easy when the room was filled with men who thought themselves the center of the world. But her ears took in every shot, her eyes followed the rhythm of their breathing, and in the back of her mind a part of her she had tried to bury for years stirred awake again. One of the SEALs, taller and broader than the rest, had taken center stage. His name was Danner, a veteran with years of combat behind him, his posture carrying the weight of battles fought in deserts and jungles most civilians would never know by name. He fired in long practice sequences, his grouping so tight that the target looked as if a single hole had been punched through it. The younger recruits and even some of the instructors watched in awe, their pride shrinking in the shadow of such mastery. When he was finished, he set the rifle down with casual ease, and one of his teammates laughed, patting him on the shoulder, declaring that no one in the room could outshoot him today. The words hung in the air, half joking, half a challenge. Maria kept her head bowed as she cleaned, but the corners of her mouth twitched ever so slightly, the faintest ghost of a smile she hadn't worn in years. The moment of silence stretched and someone, one of the younger SEALs, grinning, gestured toward Maria. "Hey, let her have a go," he said, his voice loud enough to echo down the bay. The room chuckled. The instructors glanced at one another, unsure, caught between embarrassment and amusement. Maria looked up slowly, her eyes calm, almost detached, as though the suggestion was of no consequence. She wiped her hands on a rag, folded it neatly and set it down. "I'm just here to clean," she said softly, her voice carrying no hint of boast or protest. But the younger man persisted, the teasing tone in his voice needling the moment forward. "Come on, what's the harm? She's been handling those rifles all day. Let's see if she knows which end to point forward." The laughter rolled again, but Danner didn't laugh. He studied her, his expression narrowing ever so slightly, like a man trying to place a face he almost recognized. Maria stood slowly, her knees creaking faintly, and walked toward the firing line. The room quieted, half from amusement, half from the odd weight that seemed to settle in her wake. She picked up one of the rifles, checked the chamber, adjusted the sling with movements so economical that anyone who knew weapons would have noticed. She stepped up to the firing lane, feet placing themselves as though they had been doing this forever. There was no hesitation, no wasted gesture. The rifle rose, the butt snug against her shoulder, her cheek resting against the stock with the tenderness of an old friend. Her breath slowed, her finger brushed the trigger, and for a moment time itself seemed to hold still. Then the rifle cracked, the sound sharp and clean, and the bullet tore through the paper target downrange. A perfect bullseye dead center. No deviation. No drift. The laughter cut off mid-breath, replaced by stunned silence. Maria lowered the rifle, ejected the magazine, and placed the weapon back down with the same careful respect she had shown when cleaning it. She didn't look at the target. She didn't need to. She turned back toward the group, her face unreadable, her eyes calm, and returned to the bench where her rag and cleaning kit still waited. It was only then, as the instructors retrieved the paper and held it up for the others to see, that the truth sank in. A perfect shot. The kind of shot even seasoned operators trained for years to achieve consistently. And she had done it without warming up, without ceremony, as casually as if she had been hanging laundry. The SEALs stood frozen, their bravado checked, their grins replaced with something sharper, respect mingled with unease. Danner's eyes lingered on her the longest, his jaw set tight. He had seen men shoot like that before, but never women like her, never someone who hid themselves so completely behind ordinary skin. And in that silence, with the target flapping in the air, something shifted in the room. Danner didn't say anything at first, though his teammates' voices began to rise again, their laughter nervous now, uncertain, as though they weren't sure whether to make a joke or treat what had just happened as something sacred. One of them whistled low, another muttered something about luck, but even they could feel the weight in the air. Luck didn't put a round dead center with that kind of calm precision. That was training, discipline, and something more. Maria ignored all of it. She sat back down, picked up the rag she had set aside, and began wiping down the same rifle she had been working on before, as though nothing had happened. For her, the act of cleaning seemed to matter more than the astonished eyes fixed on her. It was only Danner who finally broke the silence. "Again," he said, his voice steady, low, but with the authority of a man used to being obeyed. The instructors shifted uncomfortably, one of them starting to say something about range rules, but Maria only glanced up. For a moment her eyes and Danner's locked. His stare was the hard steel of a soldier who had seen too much, hers was something quieter, older, like water wearing away stone. Then she rose without a word, walked back to the firing lane and picked up the rifle once more. This time she didn't rush. She didn't need to. She loaded a fresh magazine, racked the bolt, and settled into her stance again. The bay had gone completely still. Even the younger SEAL who had teased her leaned forward now, watching with a focus usually reserved for battlefield engagements. Maria breathed in, breathed out, and fired 5 rounds in measured succession, each crack echoing sharply against the concrete walls. When the dust settled, the target downrange showed a single ragged hole, the 5 bullets tearing through nearly the same spot. The instructors stared, one of them muttering a curse under his breath. There was no dismissing it as chance anymore. This was mastery, the kind that came from years of repetition and experience in conditions where mistakes cost lives. Maria cleared the weapon, set it back down, and returned to her place on the bench. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The paper target spoke louder than any words could. The younger men began whispering to each other, their bravado evaporating into speculation. Who was she? How did she learn to shoot like that? One suggested she might have been military once, maybe a sniper. Another scoffed, but with less confidence than before. The instructors avoided each other's eyes, as though realizing they might have underestimated the quiet woman who had worked among them for months without ever asking for recognition. Danner, however, didn't speculate. He simply stepped forward, picked up the same rifle she had used, and took his place on the line. His shots were quick, precise, the mark of a man who knew his craft. When his target was reeled in, the grouping was excellent. Any instructor would have called it top tier, but it wasn't as tight as hers. For the first time that day, Danner's jaw flexed and something in his eyes hardened. He turned back toward her, not angry, not humiliated, but burning with the recognition of a challenge he hadn't expected. She had unsettled him, not by mocking him or trying to prove anything, but simply by existing with a skill that rivaled his own. Maria met his gaze without flinching. Her rag moved across the steel, her fingers steady, her posture relaxed. She didn't gloat, didn't smile, didn't even acknowledge the comparison. It was as if none of it mattered to her, as if the act of cleaning, of caring for the weapon, was the only thing she lived by now. Yet that calm only deepened the mystery, and Danner wasn't the kind of man who could let a mystery lie. He walked over, his boots striking heavily against the concrete floor, and stopped in front of her. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" he asked. His voice was low but direct, leaving no room for evasion. Maria didn't look up right away. She folded the rag neatly, set it aside, and finally lifted her eyes to meet his. "A long time ago," she said simply. No explanation, no elaboration. Just that. Her tone was soft but carried a finality that suggested she would not be pressed further. The younger SEALs waited, expecting Danner to push, to demand more, but he didn't. He stood there a moment longer, then gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, and stepped back. The instructors exhaled quietly as though they had been holding their breath. The range returned to its rhythm, shots from distant bays, the shuffle of boots, the scrape of brass casings across the floor, but the atmosphere had shifted. Maria's presence was no longer background noise. She had become a figure, a question mark no one could answer. The recruits who had once dismissed her now watched her out of the corners of their eyes, their conversations quieter, their laughter restrained. Even the SEALs carried themselves differently, their easy bravado tempered with something closer to humility. Maria, however, remained unchanged. She finished cleaning the rifle, set it carefully in the rack, and moved on to the next, her motion steady, her focus unbroken, as though the entire scene had been nothing more than an interruption to her work. For her, perhaps it was. Danner didn't stop watching her. Throughout the rest of the afternoon, as his team rotated through drills and exercises, his gaze would flick toward her again and again, not suspicious exactly but searching, weighing, as if trying to peel back the layers of ordinariness she wore so easily. He had met sharpshooters before, trained with the best snipers in the world, but they all carried themselves with a certain pride, an edge that announced what they were. Maria carried no such edge. If anything, she carried the opposite. An anonymity so complete that no one ever noticed her until she chose to reveal herself. That made her more dangerous in his eyes, not less. Dangerous not because she posed a threat, but because he couldn't understand her, couldn't file her away neatly into the categories his life depended on. By the time evening came and the SEALs packed up their gear, Maria was still working, wiping down the last of the rifles. She didn't look at them as they left, didn't acknowledge the respectful nods a few of them offered. Danner lingered at the door for a moment, his silhouette framed by the fading light outside. He considered speaking again, asking more questions, but something in her calm expression stopped him. Instead, he gave the slightest nod, one soldier to another, a silent acknowledgement of skill, and then he turned and walked out with the others. Maria watched him go, her face unreadable, then lowered her gaze back to the weapon in her hands. She polished the steel until it gleamed under the fluorescent lights, her motions slow, steady, unhurried. Whatever history she carried, whatever stories her silence concealed, she wasn't ready to share them. Not yet. The next morning the range was busier than usual, filled with the chatter of recruits cycling through drills, the clatter of magazines being loaded, and the sharp crack of rifles echoing off the walls. Maria arrived as she always did, carrying her small bag of cleaning supplies, her braid pulled back neatly, her expression calm. She walked past the line of shooters without drawing a second glance, just another ordinary figure slipping into the background. Yet for those who had been there the day before, her presence was no longer invisible. Whispers rippled through the room, hushed conversations about the woman who had embarrassed a Navy SEAL without saying a word. A few of the younger recruits tried to steal glances at her, curiosity tugging at them, but Maria gave no sign she noticed. She moved to her station, unpacked her tools, and began her work with the same measured patience she always carried, as if nothing at all had changed. But something had, and she could feel it in the air like a shift in pressure before a storm. Danner arrived later with his team, their boots thudding against the concrete as they strode into the bay. Their presence was magnetic, drawing every eye, but today the eyes flickered elsewhere too, toward Maria, who continued to clean rifles with quiet focus. Danner noticed. He always noticed. His men were louder than usual, throwing themselves into drills with even more vigor, perhaps compensating for the unease still lingering from yesterday. Yet for all their effort, his own attention strayed again and again to the woman in jeans and a faded shirt, her hands steady as she oiled the bolts and wiped down barrels. He had spent his life measuring people, calculating risks, identifying strengths and weaknesses. Maria didn't fit any of the categories. That unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. When the drills slowed and his men began reloading, he walked toward her, each step deliberate, the heavy tread of a man not used to asking questions twice. "You shot clean yesterday," he said quietly, stopping just a few feet from her. His tone wasn't mocking or condescending, it was matter-of-fact, the acknowledgement of one professional to another. Maria looked up briefly, her expression calm, her eyes betraying neither pride nor embarrassment. "I keep my hands steady," she said softly, then bent back over the rifle in her lap. Danner studied her a long moment, his jaw tight. That wasn't just steady hands. That was training. Real training. Her cloth moved in slow circles over the steel, the faint smell of gun oil rising between them. "Maybe once," she admitted finally. The words were quiet, almost reluctant, but they carried the weight of truth. Danner felt the shift, the confirmation of what he had suspected, and leaned a little closer. "Where?" he pressed, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Maria's eyes lifted again, and this time there was something in them he hadn't seen before, An edge of warning, like the faint gleam of a blade drawn halfway from its sheath. "Far away," she said simply, and that was all. The finality in her tone was unmistakable. Danner wanted to push, but instinct told him not to. He nodded once, a soldier's acknowledgement, and stepped back. The rest of the team watched the exchange with open curiosity, though none dared to interrupt. They had all seen Danner push people before, pry open secrets with the sheer force of his presence. But Maria remained unshaken, untouched by the weight of his questions. That alone intrigued them. As the day went on, they rotated through more drills, but the mood had shifted. The laughter was subdued, the atmosphere taut with unspoken questions. Even the instructors seemed more measured in their tones, careful not to draw attention to the undercurrent running beneath the routine. Maria, however, gave no sign of noticing. She cleaned, she polished, she set the rifles back in their racks, her motions as steady as the ticking of a clock. It was only when the shooting died down and the bay began to empty that she allowed herself a moment to pause, to look out across the range where the targets hung shredded with holes. Her gaze lingered, soft and far away, as though seeing something that wasn't there, some memory rising unbidden from the silence. Danner caught it. He had trained himself to see cracks in armor, to notice the flicker of a memory when someone thought themselves alone. He didn't approach her this time, but he filed it away, another piece of a puzzle that gnawed at him. That night, back at their quarters, his men teased each other about the mysterious woman, throwing out wild theories. Maybe she was ex-military, maybe CA, maybe some old Olympic sharpshooter hiding in plain sight. Danner didn't join in. He sat quietly, his thoughts circling the image of Maria lowering her rifle with calm indifference, as though bullseyes were nothing to her. He had spent years honing his craft, sweating through endless drills to carve precision into his bones, and yet she carried it as naturally as breathing. That wasn't something a person could fake. That was experience, deep and lived, born in places no one ever wanted to remember. He lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling, knowing he wouldn't rest until he understood. The following day he arrived earlier than usual. The range was quiet, only a few instructors moving about. Maria was already there as he had expected, her bag beside her, her hands steady as ever. She glanced up when he approached, her expression calm but faintly tired, as though she had anticipated this too. "You're not going to stop until you know," she said softly before he could speak. Danner froze for a moment, then gave a small shrug. "It's in my nature," he admitted. Maria sighed, a sound heavy with years, and set the rifle down across her lap. For a long moment she said nothing, her fingers resting gently on the cold steel, her gaze distant. Finally she spoke. "Once, a long time ago, I did more than clean rifles. I carried them." Her voice didn't rise, didn't harden, but it carried the kind of quiet that silenced even the air around them. Danner waited, but she didn't go on. Whatever story lay behind those words, she wasn't ready to open it. She stood, placed the rifle carefully in the rack, and picked up another without looking at him again. The conversation was over, at least for now. Danner walked away, his thoughts heavier than before. He had confirmation now. She had carried rifles once, not as a hobby, not as a pastime, but as part of her life. That meant something significant, something buried deep. The mystery only grew, and with it, a strange respect that unsettled him more than curiosity ever had. Maria was no ordinary woman. That much was clear. And Danner knew himself well enough to understand that mysteries like hers were never accidents. They were scars, and scars always came from battles worth remembering. The following week passed with a strange rhythm that no one could ignore. The SEALs continued their training, their drills as sharp and punishing as always, but their eyes strayed more often than not toward the woman at the far end of the bay. Maria moved through each day the same as before, cleaning rifles, sweeping brass, keeping the range in order, yet her quiet presence had taken on weight. She was no longer invisible. Her bullseye still echoed in their minds, and the mystery of who she truly was gnawed at them in ways they didn't admit aloud. Danner, especially, found himself watching her with a scrutiny that bordered on obsession. He wasn't drawn to her in the way a man might be drawn to something romantic or fleeting. No, his pull was rooted in recognition, the unmistakable sense of someone who had lived in the same shadows he had, someone who had carried the same burden of knowing what a rifle meant beyond its polished steel. He couldn't let it go. Every time he shouldered his own weapon, he remembered her calm stance, the effortless way she had sent bullets through the same hole as though the act itself were beneath her notice. One afternoon, after his men had finished a grueling exercise and scattered to rest, Danner approached her again. She was seated at her bench, oiling a rifle's moving parts with the same slow precision she always carried. He pulled up one of the stools and sat across from her, his massive frame dwarfing the space, but she didn't even flinch. She finished what she was doing, set the cloth aside, and only then met his eyes. "You've been circling me like a hawk," she said softly. "What is it you really want?" Danner leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze sharp. "The truth," he replied. "I've seen a lot of shooters in my life. I've trained with the best in the world. But what you did, there's history in that. That doesn't come from a hobby, doesn't come from a shooting club. That comes from somewhere far harder." Maria's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes drifting toward the rifles lying neatly in the rack. "Some truths are better left buried," she said at last, her voice carrying the faintest edge of sorrow. But Danner wasn't deterred. "Buried doesn't mean gone," he pressed. "Buried just means waiting to be dug up. And I don't think you'd shoot like that if you didn't still carry it with you." Maria studied him for a long moment, her gaze measuring, weighing. She could see the soldier in him, the scars hidden beneath his skin, the weight of things he had seen. It was why she hadn't dismissed him outright. Most men would have laughed, taken their bullseye and swaggered off, but not him. He looked at her the way only another veteran of shadows could. Finally she spoke, her words slow, deliberate. "I wasn't always Maria, the woman who cleans rifles at a range. Once I was someone else. Someone who did things I don't speak of. When I put a bullet through a target, it wasn't paper I was aiming at. That's all you need to know." Her eyes hardened at the end, a warning not to pry deeper. But for Danner, even that sliver was enough to confirm his instincts. She had been one of them in her own way. Maybe not a SEAL, but a ghost of some war, a shadow in a place where names didn't matter. And that made her even more fascinating, because she had walked away from it, chosen silence over the endless pride most warriors carried. Later that evening, when the bay had emptied and the echo of gunfire had faded, Danner lingered behind. Maria was still there, wiping down the last of the rifles, her motions slow as though savoring the quiet. He approached again, softer this time, his voice stripped of its edge. "I'm not trying to dig into wounds," he said. I know what it's like to carry things you can't tell anyone. Sometimes it helps to say them to someone who understands." Maria looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time she saw not the soldier, not the challenge, but the man beneath. His eyes carried weight she recognized, the same kind she saw in her own reflection when sleep refused to come. She exhaled slowly, set the rifle back in its rack and leaned back against the bench. "You think you understand," she said, her tone not cruel but weary. "But my ghosts aren't the same as yours. You fought wars under flags with brothers at your side. I fought mine alone, and the only thing at my back was silence." Danner felt the words settle over him like lead. He wanted to ask more, but the finality in her voice told him that door was still locked. Still, for the first time she had given him a piece of the truth, and that was more than he had expected. The next day the instructors arranged a friendly shooting contest between the recruits and the SEALs, a way to lift morale and sharpen focus. The atmosphere in the bay was electric, filled with anticipation, laughter, and the sharp tang of competition. Targets were set, rifles prepared, and bets whispered in the corners. The SEALs dominated the early rounds, their precision unmatched, their discipline unshakable. Recruits fired well but fell short, their nerves and inexperience showing in the scattered holes on their papers. When the contest seemed all but decided, one of the younger instructors, perhaps emboldened by the memory of Maria's bullseye, called out half-jokingly, "Why not let the cleaner lady take a shot? Give the rest of us something to cheer for." The bay erupted in laughter and clapping, but this time the humor carried a nervous edge. Everyone had heard the stories by now. Maria looked up slowly from her bench, her face unreadable. She hadn't intended to draw attention again, but the eyes fixed on her left little choice. Danner caught her glance across the room, and he gave the smallest nod, as if telling her that whether she accepted or not, it was her choice. Maria stood slowly, brushing her palms against her jeans, and walked toward the line. The room fell silent, every gaze following her. She picked up a rifle, checked it with the ease of instinct, and took her stance. Her breathing slowed, the world narrowed to the target before her. She fired once, twice, 3 times, the cracks sharp and final. When the target reeled in, 3 holes marked the same center point, indistinguishable from one another. The silence was deafening, broken only by a low whistle from one of the younger recruits. Even the SEALs said nothing this time. They just looked at her, some with awe, others with unease, all of them realizing she wasn't a story or a fluke. She was something real, something that couldn't be ignored. Maria lowered the rifle, cleared it, and set it back down. Without a word, she returned to her bench, picked up her rag and resumed cleaning as though the contest had never happened. But no one laughed anymore. Not one. By the time the contest ended, word of Maria's shooting had spread beyond the walls of the rifle bay. Stories grew as they always did, passed from mouth to mouth until rumor blurred with myth. Some said she had been an army sniper who vanished after the war. Others whispered she was special forces herself, maybe even from some secret program no one dared speak of. The truth remained locked inside her silence, and though Maria never fueled the stories, her refusal to deny them only fanned the fire. The instructors began treating her differently, no longer speaking over her or dismissing her presence as a background detail. They addressed her with quiet respect, and the recruits stole glances filled with a mixture of awe and fear. The SEALs were the most affected. Their pride made it hard to admit what they had seen, but every time she stepped to the firing line, every time she cleaned a rifle with that steady patience, they couldn't help but feel the shift inside themselves. She was a reminder that skill was not always loud, and mastery didn't need medals or uniforms to exist. Danner carried it more heavily than the rest, because his instincts told him her past wasn't just impressive, it was dangerous. One late evening the range stood nearly empty. Most had left, their voices fading into the night, but Maria stayed behind as always, methodically finishing her work. Danner lingered too, pacing slowly down the line of benches until he stopped near her. For a while he said nothing, simply watching the way her hands moved across the rifle's steel, the cloth darkened with oil. Finally he spoke in a tone softer than before, almost conversational. "You know, my men are betting on what you were. They've got you pegged as everything from an Olympic shooter to some kind of black ops ghost." Maria didn't look up, but a faint smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Let them bet," she said. "Whatever story they settle on will be better than the truth." Danner leaned against the bench, studying her profile. "And what is the truth?" She stopped wiping for a moment, her hand resting on the barrel, her eyes distant. "The truth," she said slowly, "is that once upon a time I believed I was fighting for something that mattered. I carried a rifle in places where silence was survival, where you learned to breathe with the shadows. And I learned too late that sometimes the cause isn't what they tell you it is. When I realized that, I put the rifle down and walked away." Her voice didn't tremble, but there was a weariness in it that spoke louder than tears could. Danner said nothing. He knew better than to fill silence with questions. He just nodded, acknowledging her words, even if they raised more questions than they answered. Maria resumed her work, and for a few minutes the only sound was the soft scrape of cloth against steel. Then the air was broken by the sharp slam of a door at the far end of the bay. Two recruits staggered in, half dragging a third between them. Blood soaked through his sleeve, dripping onto the floor, his face pale with shock. Panic filled the room, the young men shouting over one another, calling for help. Danner surged forward instantly, his instincts flaring, but before he could reach them, Maria was already there. She moved with startling speed, her hands steady as she pressed the boy down onto a bench, ripping open the first aid kit from the wall. "Bullet graze," she said quickly, her eyes scanning the wound with the practiced calm of someone who had seen worse. "He'll live if you keep the pressure." She wrapped the wound with precision, her fingers moving with surgical efficiency, tying the bandage tight enough to stop the bleeding but not cut circulation. Danner froze for a moment, watching her. That calm under pressure, the ability to assess and act without hesitation, it wasn't something learned from a book. It was the instinct of a battlefield medic, of someone who had kept men alive under fire. The recruits looked at her with wide eyes, their panic easing under the weight of her control. Within minutes the bleeding slowed, the boy's breathing steadied, and Maria leaned back, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Get him to the infirmary," she instructed. "Tell them the bleeding stopped but he'll need stitches." Her tone left no room for argument. The recruits obeyed instantly, carrying their wounded friend out the door. When the bay was quiet again, Danner stepped closer, his voice low but charged. "That wasn't the first time you've patched up a gunshot." Maria gave him a long look, her eyes unreadable, then shook her head slightly. "You're too observant for your own good." She stood, gathering her tools, clearly unwilling to dwell on what had just happened. But Danner couldn't let it go. "You talk about burying the past," he said, "but the past is written all over you. The way you shoot, the way you move, the way you just saved that kid without blinking. You didn't walk away from it. You just carry it differently." Maria paused, her back to him, her hands tightening briefly around the handle of her bag. "Maybe," she said quietly. "But carrying something doesn't mean you want to share it. Some burdens are meant to stay silent." With that she walked away, leaving Danner standing alone in the bay, his thoughts heavier than ever. That night, lying awake in his bunk, Danner thought of her words, of the way her eyes had seemed to drift into another world when she spoke of fighting for the wrong cause. He knew that look. He had seen it in the mirror often enough, the haunted gaze of someone who had questioned everything he had bled for. But Maria's silence was deeper than his own, her walls higher. It wasn't pride that kept her past hidden. It was pain. And that, more than anything, made him want to understand. Not to satisfy his curiosity, not to pry into something she wanted to bury, but because he recognized in her the same endless weight he carried. The weight of ghosts. He resolved then that he wouldn't push her again with blunt questions. If she wanted him to know, she would tell him. Until then he would do what few men ever did. He would wait. The days that followed seemed calm on the surface, but Danner felt the undercurrent shifting. Maria came to the range as always, arriving before dawn, leaving after everyone else, her routine as steady as clockwork. Yet there was something in her eyes, a flicker of distance, as if she felt the air tightening around her. Danner had seen that look before too. Men on deployment who knew an ambush was coming even before the first shot was fired. He said nothing, but he watched closely because he had learned long ago that when the world grew too quiet, it usually meant a storm was on its way. The recruits continued their training, their respect for Maria deepening every day. She corrected their stances without harshness, guided their breathing with calm precision, and when they hit their marks, her nod of approval carried more weight than any medal. They didn't know her story, but they knew enough, that she was a ghost from somewhere dangerous, someone who had walked paths they could only imagine. For them, that was enough to follow her without question. But outside the range, rumors had traveled further than expected. Someone who had no business hearing them finally did. And when those rumors reached the wrong ears, the quiet peace Maria had carved for herself began to crack. It started with a stranger lingering near the gate, dressed like any civilian, sunglasses hiding his eyes. He wasn't aggressive, didn't speak, just stood there too long watching the recruits march in. Danner noticed him first, his instincts prickling. By the time he walked over, the man had melted into the street and disappeared, but the sense of intrusion hung heavy. Danner didn't mention it to Maria, not right away, but he filed it in his mind like a red flag waving in the dark. 2 nights later, the flag became a flare. Maria was walking home alone, her rifle bag slung over her shoulder, the street lamp glow painting her figure in long shadows. She heard footsteps behind her, too measured to be accidental, too patient to be harmless. Without turning, she veered into a narrow alley, forcing whoever followed to commit. And they did. 2 men appeared, one tall, one stocky, both moving like professionals. Maria didn't reach for her weapon. She didn't need to. Her voice cut the air like a blade. "You followed me 3 blocks. You can speak now or you can limp home." The taller man smirked, lifting his hands slightly as if to show peace. "Relax, Maria. We're not here to hurt you. We're here to remind you." The name hit her like a stone. They shouldn't have known it. No one here called her by that name. She hid her reaction, masking it under cold stillness. "Remind me of what?" she asked. The stocky man's grin was cruel. "That ghosts don't get to hide forever. Your past doesn't stay buried. People are looking, people who don't forget. They'll come knocking soon, and when they do, this quiet little life you've built will burn." Maria's jaw tightened, but she gave no outward sign of fear. Instead, she stepped closer, her eyes narrowing until both men shifted uneasily. "Then tell them this," she said in a voice as sharp as the crack of a rifle. "If they come, they'd better not miss." With that, she brushed past them, her stride steady, though inside her chest a storm raged. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at her small table, the rifle laid bare before her, each piece cleaned with meticulous precision, as if preparing for a battle she had sworn she'd never fight again. When dawn came, she was still awake, the shadows under her eyes darker than ever. Danner noticed immediately when she arrived at the range, but he didn't press her. He knew better now. Still, his gut told him something was wrong, and when he saw the faint scrape on her wrist, the kind that came from a struggle, his suspicions hardened. He waited until the recruits were gone before speaking. "They've found you, haven't they?" Maria's hands stilled over the rifle. She didn't look at him, but her silence was answer enough. "Who are they?" he pressed. Finally, she lifted her gaze, her eyes hollow but steady. "Men who want me to go back. Men who think I still owe them blood. I left their war behind, but they don't believe anyone gets to.